This book is where The Banality of Evil came from. And the book is Eichmann in Jerusalem. The subtitle is A Report on the Banality of Evil. And the context here is that Adolf Eichmann, that's Eichmann here, he was a Nazi technocrat whose job it was to deport Jews and then eventually to evacuate Jews. And of course, evacuate was this euphemism for shipping them on trains to Auschwitz, to the death camps. So that was his job in this machine that committed one of the worst crimes in human history. And the book is about his trial, which took place in Jerusalem. It was written by Hannah Arendt, who was a Jewish philosopher during World War II. And the book is actually fairly controversial because her take on Eichmann was that he was not driven by hot hatred of Jews. Rather, he was driven by this cold negligence. And that's where the term the banality of evil comes from. It's, what does banality even mean? Banality means commonplace, boring, and bureaucratic. And she saw in Eichmann somebody who was not really paying attention to what the whole machine of the Nazi regime was doing. He was paying attention to his job. That was the thing he was focused on. And of course, she attended some of the trial. She read all of the documents of what happened in the trial. She read Eichmann's account that he wrote when he was in exile. Because actually, this trial didn't take place till the early 1960s. Because after World War II, Eichmann hid out in Argentina. And he was discovered and taken to Jerusalem to go on trial. And he ultimately, of course, hung for his role in this crime. But she's just trying to understand what happened. And she says about this, the trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were, and still are, terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and of our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all of the atrocities put together. Now, I say that he's a technocrat. So what is a technocrat? And it's somebody who's hired for their expertise, their technical expertise in something, which could be just plain management. It could be some technical aspect of making things happen. Of course, Eichmann, his technical expertise was getting populations from one place to another with these trains, managing the people that help force the emigration or force the evacuation in his case. And technocrats are essentially unelected bureaucrats, where they can exist inside corporations, they can exist inside not-for-profits, they of course can exist within the government, but oftentimes they're making some decision that does affect larger ranges of people. Like it's a collective decision that affects people collectively, but it's made from the standpoint of this cog inside a bigger machine. And the cog in the machine analogy, it's one of the big themes of the book that I think is still relevant today. And it's this notion of their focus is on their little part rather than necessarily what the whole machine is doing. And I would like to apply a salience frame model to Eichmann and his situation with the hopes of helping us think about technocrats a little more broadly. So where I'm going, first I just want to set up what is Eichmann as it relates to salience, according to Hannah Arendt, according to this author. And then I want to give a little bit of background in terms of how I'm approaching this, what is the lens that I'm looking at this through, and why. And then we'll look at the salience frame with respect to Eichmann. And then we want to ask the question, who is Eichmann? Who is this man? Because she doesn't make the argument, I think, that everybody could have done what Eichmann did. It is particular, so what about his character enabled him to do the things he did in World War II. And then we will look at 4 of his defenses that he makes in the trial. The first being that he says, I didn't kill anyone. The second being, and of course all of these are going to be not valid defenses, but they will make us think a little bit about the role of technocrat. His second argument is that he did not hate Jews. His third argument is the cog in the machine argument. I'm just a cog in a machine. Me stepping down would not have stopped the machine. His fourth argument was the social conscience argument. It was the fact that nobody in his social circles thought there was any problem. And then how did that come about? And to think about these last 2, which we're really going to pick apart more than the first 2, we want to ask the question, did he ever have a conscience that told him something was wrong? And he did have a moment of conscience, but there was this moment in his story when he sort of let go of any qualms he had about that. And this was the Wannsee Conference, where they decided the logistics of the Holocaust. And then finally, I want to look at this distancing language that I think is another theme of the book, and look at it with the Salience frame model in mind, and with the question of how can the social conscience of a society go so wrong through language that distances them from what's actually going on, from what's actually happening. To begin with, Arendt's perspective on this was that Eichmann was singularly focused on his own career at the expense of the bigger story of history that he was playing a key role in. Eichmann remembered the turning points in his own career rather well, but they did not necessarily coincide with the turning points in the story of the Jewish extermination, or, as a matter of fact, with the turning points in history. And one characterization of this book is that she's juxtaposing the two. She's juxtaposing his perspective on his career and whatnot with the bigger story of history. And there's this chilling disconnect. Now, what is the lens that I'm bringing to this problem? And there's really 2 lenses here, where the first relates to system design. And the question here is, if the banality of evil is something that does happen, that can happen, what kinds of system design can protect against that human frailty? That's a question. And of course, this is definitely not to justify Eichmann. He's definitely deeply morally culpable for what happened. But the analogy I make on this channel is the new enlightenment, this moment we're living through, where we need these concepts and system structures to protect against problems that naturally arise in systems. And the old enlightenment had this notion of checks and balances on power, where that's not to excuse a leader or a king who unjustly uses power. That king is still absolutely morally responsible. But it's to recognize that power corrupts, and that if we want systems that protect against certain things, we're going to have to design those that can function well even when power corrupts. And then a second thing that's motivating me to make this video is the question, are economists the villains? And I do consider this video to be one part of that series, because one role of economists is the role of technocrat. Now, this is separate from the body of thought that is economics. I will need to cover that in response to this question in other videos. But the technocrat question matters here, because if you look at the nodes in our economy, where decisions about where resources flow get made, and this is, of course, decisions in governments, in corporations, and in not-for-profits, the cost-benefit analysis, those types of decisions are often made by technocrats, both economists and non-economist technocrats. So it gets at this notion of complicity. And I think it's helpful to think of a spectrum of complicity, because I am not condemning all technocrats. That's not the endeavor of this video. This really is about system design. And on one hand, some people will say, oh, you're complicit in the system if you are driving a car that contributes to the car markets being a thing and that's destroying the planet. That's sort of on one end of this spectrum, but then you have other people on this spectrum. You've got the people who are buying products that are from corporations doing things that are destructive. You've got an administrative assistant who's working for a government agency that's perhaps not fully taking into account of the externalities or the side effects or the risks that it's introducing into society. You've got people in these C-suites, in these boardrooms, who are making decisions on committees where those decisions are going to deeply impact people, and sometimes in a way that's a little bit pernicious. And those people are technocrats. You've got the managers in these organizations. So as we're looking at Eichmann, we're really keeping in mind this spectrum of complicity, and we might eventually want to ask the question, how do the lessons from Eichmann apply at these different scales? And the Banality of Evil book is helpful for us because Eichmann's case is an unambiguous case of complicity. Like, nobody is going to argue that Eichmann was innocent in any way. And yet, Hannah Arendt looks at this trial with such a careful philosophical mind that the questions she explores through the trial will be helpful for us thinking about technocrats today. And she does recognize that. She does recognize that the future could bring technological and societal changes that will make these points poignant. The frightening coincidence of the modern population explosion with the discovery of technical devices that, through automation, will make large segments of the population superfluous, even in terms of labor, should be enough to make us tremble. She's so prescient in that quote. Not only is she talking about automation back in the 1960s when she wrote this, but she says population explosion. And when I hear that, I think, okay, she understands that with growing populations means this growing complexity where the different parts of the machine, where you've got lots of people acting as cogs, get more and more distanced from the thing the machine is doing. With that in mind, let's lay out our salience frame model with Eichmann in mind. Eichmann, this man who is so focused on his own career that he lost track of his role in history. So what is salience? And it's going to be what you can see, what's on your visual frame. It's going to be what is prominent to you, what sticks out on your visual frame. And it's going to be what weighs most heavily in your decision making. Now, this third one, you should think of, okay, when people are motivated to do things, oftentimes there's forces pulling them in multiple directions. Which direction do they get pulled? It depends on the weight on those scales. And that actually is not only about conscious thought. It's way deeper than that. And I'm not going to fully go into how that works or whatnot here. So for today's topic, I think we'll just think of it as the lens of your camera. Where is the lens of your camera focused? What's in strong focus? What's kind of at the edges and maybe a little bit fuzzy because it's less in focus? And what's just not even on the screen? And one thing she does in preparing for this book is she reads Eichmann's writings from when he was in exile, when he was writing about his story and what happened. And here's a quote from that. Every line of these scribblings showed his utter ignorance of everything that was not directly, technically, and bureaucratically connected with his job. So the horrific crimes that he is enabling, those are on the fuzzy edges of his screen, his camera. What's in sharp focus is his career. And in which case we have to ask the question, what determines a person's salience frame? And there's 4 relevant factors I'll talk about here, where one of these is just use or agency. What is it that you are pointing your agency at, that you have control over in the world? And the classic example of salience that I use is that when my friends got pregnant for the first time, all of a sudden, children appeared everywhere. There were like children at the grocery store and the brewery and all these places, children suddenly appeared. And so did daycares, like streets that they went down all the time. Suddenly those streets had daycares that appeared to them. them. So these daycares and these children were sort of not in the salience frame of my friends until that became relevant to them, until they had to start to rearrange their lives with the fact that they would be managing children. And they started asking questions. Can I still go to the brewery? What will it be like to go to the grocery store? What will that look like? And suddenly the answer to their question appeared. Oh, there's that woman at the grocery store who's got kids in her cart and she's doing just fine, so I'll be just fine. So that's one factor with salience frames, is that they tend to be oriented around what your agency in the world is focused on. The second orientation here is the salience frame of your social environment. And that is going to turn out to be fairly relevant for Eichmann. And it's this notion that if your friends notice it, if your social group notices it and will judge you on it and will comment on it, will judge you morally good or bad or whatnot, then that becomes relevant to you. People can't really help but absorb the salience frame of the general culture that they're embedded within. Or if you try to ignore that salience frame, you're going to have a lot of trouble operating in the culture you belong to. The third factor here is values. What values are you trying to live up to? Do you stop and engage in prayer and meditation and zoom back in your life to think about what is the bigger purpose here? Where am I placed in this tapestry of society? And that's going to be an important one, I think, when we actually condemn him. Does he have the values that even evaluate where he is? And then advertising and propaganda is definitely an influence on salience frames. In fact, one could actually say that the main avenue through which advertising and propaganda operates is by shifting people's salience frames. It's not by feeding people exact pieces of information to absorb. It's by moving the salience frame perhaps away from certain things and onto other things, and repeating things often enough, where if it's repeated often enough, it's going to move inside one's salience frame. With salience frames in mind, I'd like to return to the question of who is Eichmann? What kind of person would be capable of doing what he did? And I think it's helpful here to look at his high point in his life and his low point in his life, because that's going to tell us a lot about his character. His low point in his life was, of course, when the war ended. And let's look at Arendt's words about his reaction to that. Eichmann proved that he was a joiner, and May 8, 1945, the official date of Germany's defeat, was significant for him mainly because it then dawned upon him that thenceforward he would have to live without being a member of something or other. Eichmann said, "I sensed that I would have to live a leaderless and difficult individual life. I would receive no directives from anybody, no orders and commands would any longer be issued to me. In brief, a life never known before lay before me." Eichmann is a joiner, she says. He gets a lot of meaning from the things he joins and the structure of those things, and his role and his place in those organizations. And here he's grieving the loss of that in the end of World War II. In fact, that's the main significance of the end of the war for him. And then we rewind to 1938 to get the happiest period in Eichmann's life. And here he had just been promoted. Of course, that's part of his happiness. But let's look at Arendt's words about this. Eichmann's task had been defined as forced emigration, and the words meant exactly what they said. All Jews, regardless of their desires and regardless of their citizenship, were to be forced to emigrate, an act which in ordinary language is called expulsion. Whenever Eichmann thought, he singled out his year in Vienna as the head of the center of emigration and Austrian Jews, as its happiest and most successful period. Eichmann, for the first time in his life, discovered in himself some special qualities. There were two things he could do well, better than others. He could organize and he could negotiate. What is in the foreground of Eichmann's salience frame? And clearly it is the things he's getting praise for, the things that kind of boost his ego. That's clear from the passage. It's also these numbers, the numbers that the technocratic structure he's inside are focusing him on. And in this case, the numbers are the percentage of the Jewish population in Austria that he is able to get out of the country. And he's comparing this with the numbers in Germany, people who are in the same bureaucratic role, doing the same thing, trying to get the Jewish population out of Germany. And he's saying, oh, I'm doing better in Austria than those people in Germany, according to these metrics that we've determined that determine my value in this social structure. And this also kind of gets at what is in his salience frame. It's the people who are most similar to him, those doing the same job in a different part of the world, in a different country. And this does get at the notion that we compare ourselves to our neighbors who have similar jobs, similar incomes. We don't compare ourselves to the influencer who has 2 different mansions and is showing off their wealth. We don't compare ourselves to the person 2 rungs down on the corporate ladder from us. Rather, we find our group of comparison that determines our perception of our social value. And those people become the most salient to us, which will then drive behavior. And then, of course, his expertise is salient to him. What skill set is he trying to develop out? That's this organizing and negotiating skill set that, like all technocrats, he pays a lot of attention to it since it is the source of his success or failure inside the system. And then what is not salient to Eichmann? What's not salient is the effect he's having on the people here who are being forced out of the place where they live against their will. Those people's experience is not remotely in his salience frame. Now, it's not that he didn't know what he was doing. He knew it. And later, when he was finally moving people to Auschwitz, it's not like he didn't know what happened to them after they got off the train. She says about this, he was not stupid. It was sheer thoughtlessness, something by no means identical with stupidity, that predisposed him to become one of the greatest criminals of that period. And how does something so essential fall to the edges of a person's salience frame? And of course, there's going to be a lot of answers to this, but one of them may have to do with routine. The fact that when something becomes routine, you stop thinking about it very much. You just do it, and your focus shifts onto things that you're trying to improve or things that don't have to fall to the back of your mind. Here she says, to evacuate and deport Jews had become routine business. What stuck in his mind was bowling, being the guest of a minister, and hearing of the attack on Heydrich. And when she says bowling here, she's referring to an incident where a high-up member of the Nazi Party came to bowl with him. And he was so thrilled that this person had just wanted to be social with him. Now, of course, there was a purpose to that meeting, but this was something he thought a lot about. Oh my gosh, this high-up official came to bowl with me. That was very, very salient to Eichmann. Now, how does our salience frame model condemn Eichmann? And to understand this, it's important to understand that a person's overall salience frame is not a fixed thing. It's more of a range over which someone's lens of their camera moves. So the camera can zoom in, it can zoom out, it can move across different spaces of things people think about in general. If you're fixing your toilet yourself by using YouTube videos, your salience frame in that moment is really, really narrow. You're only thinking about the technical aspect of this toilet and how it works and the YouTubers who are explaining it, what they're trying to convey. And being zoomed in by itself, that's not a moral failing, right? And of course, when you have family over for Thanksgiving, your salience frame sort of moves over to a part of your salience frame range that maybe your lens only visits once a year to hear about those families' lives. But that's not any individual given frame where someone's looking at something and not thinking about other things. That is a salience frame, but it's not the overall salience frame. And of course, meetings at work, where everybody gathers for this boring meeting where the leaders are bringing people's attention to all these various things. The purpose of that is to orient workers' salience frames to align with the organization's mission. That's the purpose of meetings. And a lot of people will say, there's no point to meetings. Why are there so many meetings in every single organization? And salience frames are really the answer to that. So what is the moral responsibility here that he is neglecting? And to some degree, one might think of this as, how often do you zoom back to the bigger picture of your life and where that fits in with your overall effect, your net effect, given all of the little salience frames that follow you around throughout your days and weeks? And you could think of this in a spiritual sense. Like, do you ever sit down with prayer and meditation and intuit your role in the bigger picture of life? Your role in the bigger picture of your values, your community's values, all of this. Do you ever sit down and zoom back your salience frame? Which is not to say that all spirituality is zooming back. Some of it might be actually zooming in and appreciating the beauty of this flower. And maybe that exercise of zooming in, maybe that feeds into a better ability to zoom back in some kind of way. And what kind of responsibility is Eichmann abdicating by not zooming back and not thinking about these things on the edges of his salience frame that are horrific? In which case, could technocrats be let off the hook by the argument that the system had corrupted them and that anyone in the system would have been equally corrupted? And one of the answers to that may be related to this question of, are you taking the responsibility to zoom back and to sharpen your spiritual attunement to the things that you are doing and enabling? Do you have those practices that let your salience frame be aware of something you may be participating in that you don't like to look at? And Eichmann certainly did not do that. And if we're going to ask why, we need the concept of Pavlovian withdrawal. And this is the notion in psychology that when your monkey mind wanders around and visits many different territories of various things that you might dwell upon, when it reaches something that is painful to think about, that might condemn you or might paint your character in a way that you don't want to think of yourself as, Pavlovian withdrawal is the instinct to move away from that thought. Oops, I just reached a thought that's really painful. Let's move away immediately, instinctively, and protect myself from having to look in that direction. And one problem is that when people are depressed, oftentimes they stop having this Pavlovian withdrawal response. So instead of moving away from those painful thoughts, those painful memories or painful ideas, they dwell on those and it sort of brings them down, and that's part of their depression, or can be part of their depression, is a letting go of the Pavlovian withdrawal instinct. And in some ways, there's this balance with Pavlovian withdrawal, where on one hand, if you always move your mind away from the painful, then you will never actually look at the complicity of your behavior. You will never actually look at the ways that you are contributing negatively to the world and to people around you. So that's not good. To always move away from those painful things is really evil and unhealthy. And yet, to dwell too much on those will suck you into to an inability to actually act on the world and participate. Like, if you're so focused on your own moral failings that you can't look away from them, that will suck energy in a way that will stop you from being good to your children and taking responsibility for your aging parents and the things that you have to do in life that you need energy to invest in. That will dissipate if you spend too much time looking at the painful. So in some ways, there's this balance for people to strike in an ethical or a spiritual sense. And this is why many religions, and Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, do require some amount of reflection on the things that are painful about one's behavior in the world to reflect upon. For example, in Alcoholics Anonymous, there is this notion of putting together a fearless and searching moral inventory. And that means you have to spend a little bit of time looking at those things that are really painful to look at. And that's not that you spend your whole life looking at those every single moment of existence. It might be that you set a kitchen timer and for half an hour you write about your moral failings. And when it's done, you let that go and you let it be done. And if you do this a little bit every day, the idea is hopefully it will seep into your salience frame, ideally in a way that ultimately changes your behavior, in a way that better serves you and your values and the people you care about. So I think many of these religious and spiritual practices have ways of balancing this Pavlovian withdrawal response with a healthy amount of looking at one's failings without letting that take over. Now, it's also worth noting that Eichmann's particular salience frame, where he's very bureaucratically and career-focused, this is not the only salience frame that can be accused of the banality of evil. For example, she mentions in this book someone named Becher, and Becher's salience frame was all about money. That seemed to be his driving force, which was different than Eichmann's. And she says about them, Becher was a born businessman, and where Eichmann only saw enormous tasks of organization and administration, Becher saw almost unlimited possibilities for making money. And it's not hard to see how both of those salience frames could get really corrupted inside the Nazi regime. Now let's move to Eichmann's defenses of himself. And we're going to look at 4 of them, and of course in Eichmann's case, none of these defenses will be at all valid for him. But the first of these is going to be his notion that he did not kill anybody directly. Like, he's trying to get off the hook because he did not pull any triggers. But Eichmann, as he vainly tried to explain in Jerusalem, had never belonged to the higher party circles. He had never been told more than he needed to know in order to do a specific, limited job. Eichmann said, "With the killing of Jews, I had nothing to do. I never killed a Jew or a non-Jew, for that matter. I never killed any human being. I never gave an order to kill either a Jew or non-Jew. I just did not do it." And yet, he played a vital role in making things happen. In fact, he didn't necessarily give orders, but he managed people and was involved in the management of people who did more of the dirty work. And of course, management is part of his technocratic expertise. So he's managing the motivations, the orientations, and even the salience frames of these people who are doing horrific things. And let's look at that situation. And Eichmann said the people doing some of the dirty work under them had to be treated with kid gloves. They were not ordered around for the simple reason that if the chief officials had been told what to do in the form of, you must, you have to, that would not have helped matters any. If the person does not like what he is doing, the whole works will suffer. We did our best to make everything somehow palatable. And of course, a manager's job is very related to the salience frames around which people work. So Eichmann, in shaping people's salience frames around their work, is having to pay attention to their motivation, what they like, what they don't like, what they're looking at, what they're getting grumbly about. And he's having to make everything palatable as a manager. And good managers, of course, have to think about the other person's perspective. These are people who are doing the dirty work. They're having to look some of these horrible things in the face as they're doing them. And yet, she says about Eichmann that he's actually not that great at looking at things from other people's perspective. A decisive flaw in Eichmann's character was his almost total inability ever to look at anything from the other fellow's point of view. So his claim that he did not directly pull the trigger will not hold up. The second defense that Eichmann makes for himself is his claim that he did not hate Jews. Now, this is something that's actually somewhat controversial about this book, because Hannah Arendt agrees with him on that point. She agrees that she is not seeing someone with a hot hatred for Jews. That's not her interpretation. Now, of course, other people have looked at this and said, actually, she didn't attend the whole trial. She only attended a few days. She's actually missing some of what's going on. So this is a disputed point. But let me give you a quote that gets at her perspective here. His was obviously also no case of insane hatred for Jews, of fanatical anti-Semitism, or of indoctrination of any kind. He personally never had anything whatsoever against Jews. On the contrary, he had plenty of private reasons for not being a Jew hater. And two questions that this raises are, first of all, if we could somehow resolve what was actually in Eichmann's heart, like if there were some magic technology that allowed us to decide, does he or does he not hate Jews? If the answer was definitively no, he doesn't hate Jews, that's not what's driving him, does that let him off the hook for participating and doing the things he did? And I think most people would say, actually, no, that does not let him off the hook, not even a little bit. And then the second question is it possible for someone to participate in the thing he participated in without hot hatred for Jews? And I do think this gets at the notion of contempt. And I will oftentimes define contempt as being a long-standing perception or perseveration of a group being intellectually inferior, morally inferior, or beneath consideration. And of those three things, the first two are really hot types of contempt. They're driven by hatred, they're driven by this ugly drive inside a person. And the third, the thought that this group or person is beneath consideration, that's more of the cold banality of evil kind of contempt. And I think it's important to think of this when it comes to power, because oftentimes people in power have the ability to not think very much about the effects they have on the side. Whereas someone who's constantly experiencing the negative effects of someone's choices, for them, it's way more likely to be a hot type of contempt because they can't let it go. And of course, contempt of all types is very unhealthy for people, and it's connected to evil. Even when, of course, for someone who's on the bottom of the hierarchy and experiencing the negative effects of someone in power, their contempt may be absolutely justified. It's still unhealthy. It can still seep out in evil ways. But this notion of this cold type of contempt, which I think is at the heart of the banality of evil, is just when you're considering what are the side effects, if you happen to run across somebody who's saying, our group is having this huge negative side effect from your choices, someone in power has the power to be like, no, that's not really a thing. And maybe they have some semi-logical, non-logical reason for dismissing it, but they have the option to not think much about it. And in some ways, I think that's at the essence of the banality of evil. And this dismissing of people's perspectives, especially if those people's perspectives are painful because they would condemn one to complicity. I do think social media right now is a marketplace for reasons to dismiss the other. It's a marketplace for psychologically valid reasons for dismissing people. This doesn't mean they're actually valid reasons to dismiss people. It just means if you don't want to have to think about that because it's painful, but it keeps popping up among conversations you're participating in, how can you psychologically dismiss that in a way that feels okay? And if you are not able to dismiss it, you can go to social media and find somebody with your perspective who has come up with some convoluted way, or usually it's not convoluted. I think usually it's just a quick phrase, they're too old, they're too conservative or too liberal or too whatever, that little phrase, you just slap that on the front of whatever critique it is, and it feels fine to move that out of one's salience frame. So defense number 2 is invalid. The third defense is the cog in the machine defense. So let's look at Arendt's words about this. We heard the protestations of the defense that Eichmann was after all only a tiny cog in the machinery of the final solution, and of the prosecution which believed it had discovered in Eichmann the actual motor. I myself attribute no more importance to both theories than did the Jerusalem court, since the whole cog theory is legally pointless, and therefore it does not matter at all what order of magnitude is assigned to the cog named Eichmann. In its judgment, the court naturally conceded that such a crime could be committed only by a giant bureaucracy, using the resources of government. But insofar as it remains a crime, and that, of course, is the premise for a trial, all cogs in the machinery, no matter how insignificant, are in court forthwith transformed back into perpetrators, that is to say, into human beings. And that dehumanization can apply both to the victims of whatever bureaucratic machine may be in operation, but also it's dehumanizing to the cogs inside the machine. Now, there's going to be 2 positions of a person sitting in a cog role that can, for them, or at least in their minds, justify that role. Where one is going to be the trusting the system argument, and the other is going to be, even if you don't trust the system, even if you see the bad things it's doing, it's this notion of, if I stepped down, that wouldn't change the machine, and I'm doing a better job, or I can do more good than whoever would step into that cog role after me. So those are the 2 arguments I would like to unpack by looking at the text. Regarding the trusting the system perspective and arguments, there's different versions of this, where one of them is going to be, there must be somebody somewhere in the system who's looking at all negative side effects and who's looking at all externalities. And that person or that role, they're the ones responsible for that, for anything that goes wrong. And that's not my role, that's their role, so I'll let that person do that. But of course, not all systems have people who are designing the system. Many systems simply evolve. In fact, most systems that are as complex as any system we live in today probably have at least some elements, if not most elements, of emergence inside the system. And I think here's a relevant quote from Hannah Arendt. Of course, it is important to the political and social sciences that the essence of totalitarian government, and perhaps the nature of every bureaucracy, is to make functionaries and mere cogs in the administrative machinery out of men, and thus to dehumanize them. And one can debate long and profitably on the rule of nobody, which is what the political form known as bureaucracy truly is. The second stance of a cog here is going to be the better me than somebody else stance. And there's a bit of a drop in the bucket portion of this stance where it's an acknowledgement that if I were to step out of my role as the cog, that would make no difference at all. Someone would just step back into it. So by stepping down from this role and not participating in whatever's going on, I'm not making a decision between this regime reigning and this regime not reigning. I'm making a decision to step down that would have no effect at all. Like, that drop in the bucket argument, I do think is part of what's going on in people's minds when they run this experiment through their heads. And then oftentimes the second part of this is, well, if I step down, somebody worse than me is going to step into this role, and the system's going to do even more atrocious things than it's already doing. And Arendt has a name for people who are using this kind of logic. She calls them the inner immigrants. And Eichmann himself never made this kind of claim in terms of his logic, but here's what she says. While Eichmann may have never encountered an inner immigrant, he must have been well acquainted with the many of those numerous civil servants who today assert that they stayed in their jobs for no reason other than to mitigate matters, to prevent real Nazis from taking over their posts. And in critiquing these people, Arendt points out that their calculus didn't always always pan out. Dr. Kastner in Hungary, for instance, saved exactly 1,684 people, with approximately 476,000 victims. Of course, one possibility with a lot of these people is that this kind of logic and reasoning didn't actually appear until after the Nazi regime had fallen, and they needed some excuse to protect themselves in court. But let's say there were people who were really inside the Nazi regime, really trying to wrestle with the situation that they saw with this kind of logic. And here she's really talking about the calculus of the costs and benefits, which does lead us to some of the technocrats, like economists, who sit in these decision-making roles around these boards of directors who determine where resources flow and what part of the garden of the economy is going to dry up and wither away. But in the context of this calculus done by these inner immigrants, I do want to at least ask the question, what are the distortions of the salience frames of people who are operating inside these machines as these cogs? What distortions of salience frames enter the social atmosphere inside these bureaucracies? I guess I just want to pose that question to you. Eichmann's fourth defense was what I'm calling the social conscience defense. It was the fact that Eichmann was exporting his moral responsibility to the collective intelligence of the group of people, the whole society that he belonged to. And of course, that society failed. But from his perspective, what he said is nobody around him, nobody at all, except for one person, we'll get to that in a second, nobody saw anything wrong with what was going on. Nobody pointed it out. Nobody discussed it. As Eichmann told it, the most potent factor in the soothing of his own conscience was the simple fact that he could see no one at all, who actually was against the final solution. Oh, and the final solution, by the way, was the euphemism the Nazis used for the Holocaust, for the extermination, the killing of an entire Jewish population. Now, what about the exception? What was the one exception of someone Eichmann encountered who questioned what was going on? The man who was the exception had asked Eichmann to stop the death mills at Auschwitz, and Eichmann had answered that he would do it with the greatest pleasure, but alas, it was outside his competence, and outside the competence of his superiors. And Arendt says that he brought up this one man, this one example, over and over in the trial. How there was only one time when anyone questioned what was going on. Which is part of our point here, is that everybody else around him was totally just going along. And this gets at the notion that our ethical salience frame is partly, if not largely, determined by our social environment. And for Hannah Arendt, when she's painting a picture of Eichmann's character and asking the question, how could he become this type of villain? What about him made him a good candidate to do what he did? Part of her answer was the fact that he was kind of overawed by this good society, what he calls the good society. Eichmann had always been overawed by good society. His conscience was indeed set at rest when he saw the zeal and eagerness with which good society everywhere reacted as he did. He did not need to close his ears to the voice of conscience, as the judgment has it, not because he had none, but because his conscience spoke with a respectable voice, with the voice of respectable society around him. And not only this, he viewed this kind of stance as being humble somehow, as if he followed a conscience that was different from the people around him, that would be him setting himself up arrogantly against the moral conscience of everybody around him. In which case, who was able to resist the degenerate ethical frame of the society around them in the Nazi regime? And she kind of hints at three different types of people. One is the people who are arrogant enough to follow their conscience against the ethical intuitions of everybody around them. A second will be people who are guided by the old values of thou shalt not kill. These are the values of the social society from before the Nazi regime, which of course would not have not have viewed upon killing an entire population positively. And then the third is religion. It's people whose ethical frame was oriented toward a religious group, a social environment that was grounded in many ways way before the Nazi regime. These are sort of three realms of people who were able to resist the ethical depravity of this society. Now, did Eichmann ever have a social conscience? And the answer was yes. In fact, when he first heard about the final solution, this is the plans to kill all Jews in Germany, his reaction was to be upset. Like, his social conscience did seem to irk him a bit at first. He himself had never thought of such a solution through violence, and he described his reaction in the same words. "I now lost everything, all joy in my work, all initiative, all interest. I was, so to speak, blown out." So what was it that quieted his conscience so definitively that he eventually just put it out of mind? And there was a particular moment for him where this happened. This was at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. And this conference was basically a meeting of Nazis who was meant to decide the logistics of carrying out the Holocaust. Hitler had already decided on the final solution, and he was saying, okay, you all go figure out how to do this. And Eichmann at this conference was the lowest ranked person in attendance. This conference only lasted an hour and a half, and yet it went down in history as an infamous turning point for the Jewish population. The aim of the conference was to coordinate all efforts toward the implementation of the final solution. The discussion turned first on complicated legal questions, such as the treatment of half and quarter Jews. Should they be killed or only sterilized? This followed by a frank discussion of the various types of possible solutions to the problem, which meant the various methods of killing. And absent of the discussion was any conversation about, should we do this? Is this ethical? What's actually going on here? It was all focused on these logistics. And by focusing on the logistics in this way, it moved any moral discomfort that Eichmann had outside of his Salience frame. It was his Pontius Pilate moment. Although he had been doing his best right along to help with the final solution, he had still harbored some doubts about such a bloody solution through violence. These doubts had now been dispelled. Eichmann said, "At that moment I sensed a kind of Pontius Pilate feeling, for I felt free from all guilt. Who was he to judge? Who was he to have his own thoughts on the matter? Well, he was neither the first nor the last to be ruined by modesty." And of course, Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor who presided over Jesus' trial that ultimately led to his death on a cross. What followed, as Eichmann recalled, went more or less smoothly and soon became routine. He quickly became an expert in forced evacuation, as he had been an expert in forced emigration. So in terms of Eichmann's job before versus after the Wannsee Conference, before the job it was forced emigration. After the job, it was forced evacuation, which was euphemism for sending Jews on the train to Auschwitz to their death. And this notion of euphemism could be potentially important in questions like, how does a society lose its way so fundamentally as the Nazi society did? Like, how is it that the social conscience of that whole society had failed to be able to properly see and properly evaluate what they were doing with regards to the Jews? How did that happen? And potentially language may have some role. It's this notion of distancing language. Language that creates distance between the person making the decision and the actual effects of their choices. To where if the language is really distant, then something does not come properly into focus in their salience frame. And it just so happens that the Nazi regime had really tight control over language. All correspondence referring to the matter was subject to rigid language rules. and it is rare to find a document in which such bald words as extermination, liquidation, or killing occur. The prescribed code names for killing were final solution, evacuation, and special treatment. The net effect of this language system was not to keep people ignorant of what they were doing, but to prevent them from equating it with the old normal knowledge of murder and lies. Eichmann's great susceptibility to catchwords and stock phrases made him, of course, an ideal subject for language rules. Eichmann really clung to these language rules. And this was actually part of his personality that she brought out, the fact that he just loved catchphrases and he said them over and over and characterized different periods of life in these catchphrases. That was just something about Eichmann as a person. Now, how did the construction of this distancing language happen? Was this something intentional that the Nazis did? And the answer was sort of. So we actually have to turn to the person behind a lot of this language control, or the person who came up with a lot of the phrases. And this is Himmler, the member of the Nazi hierarchy most gifted at solving problems of conscience was Himmler. He coined slogans. Eichmann remembered only one of them and kept repeating it. These are battles which future generations will not have to fight again. And here I cannot help but think of Pavlovian withdrawal. How if there's something where your mind starts to go there and it starts to be painful, you want to slap a catchphrase on that to dismiss it so that your mind can move in another direction and feel satisfied about dismissing it. And phrases like Himmler came up with were just really psychologically satisfying, I think, to people in dismissing the reality of what they were doing. And Himmler's language control turned out to be somewhat useful in channeling people's ethical sensibilities, channeling their intuitions in a direction that was useful to the regime. Hence, the problem was how to overcome not so much their conscience as the animal pity which all normal men are afflicted by in the presence of physical suffering. The trick used by Himmler, who apparently was rather strongly afflicted with these instinctive reactions himself, was very simple and probably very effective. It consisted in turning these instincts around, as it were, and directing them toward the self, so that instead of saying, "What horrible things I did to people," the murderers would be able to say, "What horrible things I had to watch in the pursuance of my duties. How heavily the task weighed upon my shoulders." And that passage kind of harkens back to our discussion of management and the technological expertise that goes along with management, which manages people's salience frames. It manages how people think as they encounter the positive and the not so positive parts of their job. And I would just like to close this with a couple of quotes from the end of the book that I think pulls together this discussion of the banality of evil in Eichmann's case. Except for an ordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all. He merely, to put the matter colloquially, never realized what he was doing. It was precisely this lack of imagination which enabled him to sit for months on end, facing a German Jew who was conducting the police interrogation, pouring out his heart to the man, and explaining again and again how it was that he reached only the rank of lieutenant colonel in the SS, and that it had not been his fault that he was not promoted. In principle, he knew quite well what it was all about. He was not stupid. It was sheer thoughtlessness, something by no means identical with stupidity, that predisposed him to become one of the greatest criminals of that period. That such remoteness from reality and such thoughtlessness can wreak more havoc than all the evil instincts taken together, which perhaps are inherent in man. That was, in fact, the lesson one could learn in Jerusalem. But it was a lesson, neither an explanation of the phenomenon, nor a theory about it. And in the court's final ruling to Eichmann, The court said this: "You also said that your role in the final solution was an accident, that almost anybody could have taken your place, so that potentially almost all Germans are equally guilty. What you meant to say was that where all, or almost all, are guilty, nobody is." This is an indeed quite common conclusion, but one that we are not willing to grant you. If you appreciated the salience discussion in this video, you might be interested in my video on how power corrupts, which also uses a salience frame, looking at essentially a technocrat as they move up within the system.